Hey guys, my name is Jason Schuster. I'm a doctor of physical therapy. I own Intricate Art Spine and Body Solutions. It's a continuing education company, and I teach other doctors how to do a couple things to give them continuing education credits to maintain their medical licenses. One of the most poorly understood aspects of medicine is DNA and how our genes work. And unfortunately, the vast majority of what is taught in medical school about DNA and RNA and how the epigenome works, if it's taught at all, is totally wrong. Right? So, back when Mendel and Darwin first kind of started thinking about DNA, what the basic thought was is that whatever our DNA says is how we're going to be, right? You have X DNA, you're going to come out X way. That is basically 100% wrong. There's only a few, very, very rarely do people have an actual gene anomaly that guarantees that you're going to have some type of problem. So, like Down syndrome would be one, trisomy 21, some other ones like Huntington's and some other things like that. The ApoE4 allele would be another one that's relatively detrimental but not guaranteed to cause you a problem. But the things like Down syndrome, you have a triplication of a gene, you're going to have some serious issues. The vast majority of problems that people have are not because their genes are a certain way. 99.9% of all human DNA is the same. It's just the way that our DNA is expressed is what makes us taller or have different color skin or different color eyes. We all have basically the same underlying soup of genes. It just depends on how those genes get expressed and in what pattern and in what order or in how much they get expressed or if they get expressed at all that determines how we're going to be. And that would be the epigenetics, right? So the epigenetics are basically the chemical or molecular tags that actually get attached onto the double helix of DNA, which we'll talk about in a second. And depending on what tags get put on there, like methyl tags or acetyl tags or other different types of tags, that will change the electric potential, the electric charge of the molecule. It'll change the positive and negative charge slightly, and it'll change the way that that DNA is read and expressed, or if it's expressed. So just because we have genes for things doesn't mean that they're going to be expressed and produce proteins, right? So the normal way that proteins get produced in the human body is DNA is a double-stranded helix. DNA gets transcribed into RNA. RNA gets translated into proteins, and the proteins are things that actually do stuff. However, this is another major misunderstanding in medicine. The DNA, we have never found instructions in DNA that tells the proteins how to work. So just because the DNA produces certain proteins, as far as we understand, there's no instructions for the proteins to know how to work. It just has to do something with the amount and concentration of certain proteins in certain areas and what electric charge they have on them and a whole bunch of other stuff that we're just scratching the surface on understanding right now. So one of the best guys to read his research on this stuff and listen to him on YouTube, you guys, his name is Michael Levine. He's, I believe, I can't remember what school he's at, but he's doing groundbreaking research on looking at just how the electric charge will change the way that proteins act, and it'll totally change the way that DNA expresses itself. So he's been able to take worms, right, and not change their DNA at all. He just changes the chemical markers that are on the DNA. And when you cut these worms in half after he does this, they continuously grow two heads. So they don't regrow a tail or regrow a head. They just regrow two heads. And that is passed on from generation to generation within the worm. So one of the things that is completely misunderstood about the epigenome in most mainstream medicine, most regular doctors don't know about any of this stuff at all, you guys. This is why this is so important to understand, is that if you're messing with your DNA and your RNA, or if you're taking injections of something, if you just eat bad for your life, right? Eating bad, eating a ton of processed food is going to change the way that your DNA is marked, the way that your epigenome is, and that is able to be passed on to your children. Not only does that get passed on from cell to cell as your cells replicate and go towards the Hayflick limit, that a lot of those markers, not all of them, but a ton of the epigenetic markers will get passed on from generation to generation. So I think the easiest example to think about this is pro athletes and their kids. Like, obviously, pro athlete kids typically have a bunch of other advantages. Like, obviously, their parents know how to play sports, and they typically have money to play sports, and they have good coaching and stuff. But if they're not physically able to do it, they're just not going to be pro athletes. So one of the reasons that so many pro athlete children end up being pro athletes themselves is because part of their parents' epigenetics get passed on to them, so their DNA gets expressed in a way that makes them super athletic. If their parents had that DNA, that doesn't guarantee that their kids are gonna be athletic. The DNA has to be expressed in a certain way, and things that you eat when you're growing up, the way that your parents eat, all of that stuff plays a role. So the DNA itself gets marked by the epigenetic markers. That changes how the DNA is expressed. It does not change your DNA. You still have the same DNA. It just changes what genes are expressed and in what quantity and in what relationship to other genes. And this changes your health status, right? So the epigenome is changeable throughout life. It depends on exercise, eating well, taking care of your autonomic nervous system, getting treatments like dry needling and joint manipulation to decrease chronic sympathetic hyperactivity. All of these things. Chronic sympathetic hyperactivity is something that the vast majority of Americans are living with, right? So 80% of America right now in 2024 is either overweight, obese, or morbidly obese. We're still using the same blood panel. The comprehensive metabolic blood panel that we're using in 2024 is the same exact blood panel that we were using in the 1950s, right? So we're basically still running our medical system like we were before we had any of this knowledge. And all of this knowledge that's taught about DNA in medical schools is basically totally wrong. It's objectively wrong in 2024. We know that it's not true. And yet 95+% of medical doctors go through their whole career assuming that they know how the DNA works because that's how they got taught in school. Unfortunately, what they got taught in school is information back from the 1960s and 70s, right? Medical school information doesn't change for about 20 to 30 years after new information is out, right? And it's even worse than that. Like, there's stuff from 40, 50 years ago that we're still not taught in medical school, right? So very, very interesting stuff. Here is another good picture of epigenetic mechanisms, right? So this is a good thing to understand. So DNA is made up of chromatin. Chromatin has little proteins in it. So we have histones and nucleosomes. So the histones and the nucleosomes are what the DNA winds around. So the histones are the little turquoise pizza slices in here, and the nucleosome is the whole pizza. So there's 8 histones make up a nucleosome, right? And then the DNA wraps around the nucleosome, and it's like a fishing spool, right? Or like a little thread bobbin. That's what the DNA gets wrapped around. So there's about 6 feet of DNA inside the nucleus of each cell, and the nucleus of each cell is about 10 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. And then, as you can see in this right block picture here, that red part of the gene, right? So that's DNA that's getting unraveled in between 2 nucleosomes. The red part would be part of a gene that can be expressed because it's exposed to the cellular environment. Once it gets rewrapped around the nucleosome, the gene stops being expressed. And it's just crazy the amount of stuff that is going on constantly, the trillions of processes. Our DNA is winding and unwinding and rewinding and exposing certain pieces of it to be read and then winding them back up and exposing other pieces. And this is all done without our conscious knowledge. And what significantly affects this is the quality of the food that you're eating. If you have vitamin deficiencies, if you aren't taking care of your autonomic nervous system, you're going to be in chronic sympathetic hyperactivity, which at least 90% of the United States is. I mean, 80% of the United States is overweight. So that guarantees that those 80% of the people are living with chronic sympathetic hyperactivity all the time, which totally degrades the way that our DNA gets read and expressed, right? So people, like with COVID, for example, body-wide inflammation was a big problem with a lot of viruses. You don't develop inflammation randomly. The genes that are responsible for developing pro-inflammatory proteins need to be expressed like that little red part of the gene. So if the interleukin-1 gene or the gene that's genes that's responsible for creating the interleukin-1 protein, tumor necrosis factor alpha protein, C-reactive protein from the liver, those are all pro-inflammatory proteins. So those chunks of DNA are the different chunks of DNA that need to be combined to be expressed to produce those proteins are being overexpressed when we have problems and we have chronic sympathetic hyperactivity. If you can normalize the autonomic nervous system, you can normalize the way that the genes are expressed, and you can normalize your health, right? It's really, really cool. It's totally modifiable, and this is not something that mainstream medicine thinks. Still, over 90% of doctors think that no matter what, it just depends. Whatever your DNA is how you're going to be. Healthy, unhealthy, whatever. That is not true. You can change the way your DNA is expressed if you understand how this stuff works. So gene alleles. So this is something that's really, really important to understand. So identical twins are the only people that have the identical expression of the same gene alleles. You and me have the same genes, but we have different gene alleles. So we have the same underlying genes, but alleles are just the slight differences in the way those individual genes are expressed. So you have one allele, you have two alleles for each gene. They can be dominant or recessive, and it kind of depends on what genes they are and how they interact with other genes. But this would be like an example for blue eyes, right? So you have blue eyes, you would have to have a double little a. All the other ones would produce not blue eyes, because if it's a recessive gene, you need to have homozygous recessive to have full expression of blue eyes, right? So identical twins have identical gene alleles. Everybody else has basically identical genes, but the gene alleles are different, right? So that's what makes people taller and shorter. This is what is really important, and what people are trying to figure out right now in cutting edge science is how to supplement with vitamins and nutrition and peptide therapy and more newer technology that's getting into looking at how we can alter the epigenome. So again, if you're eating McDonald's every day, your body's going to be expressing way too many pro-inflammatory genes. If you eat good organic food every day, your body is not going to be overexpressing those inflammatory genes every day, and that is changeable. If you go from eating good organic food to eating McDonald's every day, the way your genes are expressed is going to change. The only way that our health significantly changes is if the epigenome changes and the way that our genes are expressed changes. Those would be gene alleles. So you'd have matching alleles on each side of the chromosome, more or less. That may not be exactly how it is, but that's an easy way to think about it. And then it depends on how the different alleles of the gene are expressed and what expressions of the alleles you have and in what combination you have them, which is going to determine how your phenotype is or how you're actually come out. So another thing to really keep in mind, you guys, and this is what is totally insane about messing around with genetic therapies, is that the part of the human genome that we have so-called discovered is about 10 to 20% of all of our genes max. There's about 20,000 protein coding genes in the human body. That means the CDC on their website openly admits that we know basically nothing about 80 to 90% of all of our DNA, because it doesn't code for proteins and we have no idea what it does. But we do know that if it's removed, you die. We have no idea what 90% of our DNA and RNA does. So that should make you think about some recent medications that people have been taking in the recent past with RNA. It is 0% chance that can be safe, right? This is what I always tell people. If you were in the jungle and so you came across some little dude in the jungle and he said, "Hey, I'll give you $200 to stick your hand in that hole down to your elbow." And if you said, "Well, hey, what's in the hole?" If he said, "I'm 10% sure that you'll come out with your arm still attached. I'm 90% sure that I have no idea if you're going to lose your whole arm or not." Would you stick your hand in that hole? That's what's going on with RNA and DNA therapy right now. We don't know what 90% of it does. So I just say that to warn everybody. It is not a good thing to be messing around with. However, supplementation, vitamins, peptide therapy, using natural substances to improve the way that our epigenome is expressed, to improve the way that our DNA is expressed, to improve our health, is 100% natural and safe. And it's one of the things that we go over in my 5-course series on nutrition, supplementation, peptide therapy, epigenetics, and vitamin deficiencies. So this is a great 5-course series, you guys. They're all 5 CEUs, certified by the Texas Physical Therapy Association and the Board of Athletic Training. The first course, we have a free code. It's TRY, IANUTR, TRY, IANUTR. That's a free code for the intro course. And then we have 4 other courses afterwards. So you guys check it out on our website, intricateartseminars.com.